Now turning to the big debate. The 11-year war in Afghanistan is supposed to be coming to a close. International forces are meant to hand over full control of the nation to their Afghan partners by 2014. That partnership has come into question as Afghan President Karzai has engaged in a war of words with the U.S. and NATO leaders. Jonathan Ginsburg has the story.
This spring, our forces will move into a support role, while Afghan security forces take the lead. Tonight, I can announce that over the next year, another 34,000 American troops will come home from Afghanistan. This drawdown will continue, and by the end of next year, our war in Afghanistan will be over.
U.S. President Barack Obama is calling for a responsible, incremental exit of American forces from Afghanistan by 2014. Afghan President Hamid Karzai has agreed to this plan and pledged to be a force for progress in the effort. However, in the last month, Karzai has embarked on a series of allegations and unprecedented threats aimed at foreign powers. Karzai first stopped Afghan forces from calling in U.S. airstrikes after 10 civilians were killed in a controversial incident. He then ordered U.S. Special Forces out of the key Wardak province following complaints of abuse. Karzai topped off the orders by accusing NATO and U.S. forces of colluding with the Taliban to extend their presence in the country.
The bombing that took place yesterday and was carried out in the name of the Taliban, these actions in fact show that the Taliban are at the service of the foreigners and are not against the foreigner. These bombings show that the Taliban want a longer presence of foreigners, not their departure from Afghanistan.
Reports show American forces are still operating in Wardak. The U.S. Secretary of Defense has hinted a deal may allow them to stay in exchange for a long-standing demand for the U.S. to hand over all prisoners at Bagram prison. The war of words has escalated, with NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen calling Karzai's accusations ridiculous. An Afghan presidential spokesperson countered, saying the NATO war in Afghanistan is aimless and unwise to continue. For today on Beyond Beijing, I'm Jonathan Ginsburg.
Thank you, Jonathan. Today, our panel of experts will look at the progress in Afghanistan today, the complaints being launched by the Afghan president, and the outlook for foreign involvement in Afghanistan.
So today we are talking in a studio with Tianli Wei, Research Fellow at the China Institute of Contemporary International Studies. And also joined us in the studio is Paul James, a journalist based in Beijing. And also joining us on the phone is Lan Jianxue, Research Fellow on Afghanistan at the China Institute of International Studies. And he's also a former Chinese diplomat.
Welcome to you all. Good to have you with us.
Hi, everyone.
Hi. Now, let me start out, each of you getting an overview question. The question, of course, is what is Afghanistan like today? How would you describe the situation? Getting better, getting worse, staying the same? Let me start here in the studio with Tianli Wei.
I think for a long time, the situation in Afghanistan is, compared with the past, I think the more uncertainties when it is approaching the handover of power from the U.S. troops, NATO troops to the Afghanistan authority. So I think there will be more and more rebels, uncertainties, violence before the end of the day. Mm-hmm.
Paul James, how do you describe the situation?
Well, it's interesting if you look at it from a broader perspective. If you mentioned an 11-year war, you really have to go back to 1979 when the Soviets invaded to really sort of get a sense of where Afghanistan has been heading over the past generations. In that you've got second and third generation Afghan men who have known nothing but war, and you've got a society now that is shattered and really needs to be rebuilt. And one question is, how do you go about doing that? So the broader question is, are we better off now in Afghanistan without the Taliban? Well, if you asked half the population, being women, they would most likely say yes. But on the other hand, you find yourself in a very unstable country right now and an unstable society, which really has to be dealt with. Unstable society,
Lan Jianxue, how do you see it?
No, I would describe the situation in Afghanistan today as critical. I can't say it's better or worse. It's very critical at this period because the 2014 is coming closer, and every forces concerning Afghanistan issues are taken into part. So I think maybe in some areas securitized by U.S. and NATO forces is peaceful, but in some other provinces, I think it still remain in very severe situation. This is my observation.
So looking back at the last few years, Qian Liwei, actually international forces are beginning to pull back and hand over security to the Afghan military. During this time, the U.S. military and the ISAF, the international security forces, have been accused of various abuses. So generally speaking, how would you rate the performance of the international security forces there?
On one hand, the NATO forces do a lot for the Afghanistan people, but on the other hand, there are some sometimes hated by the Afghan people the abuses of the human rights. For example, the drones, the U.S. drones bombarding the Afghan villages and hurt a lot of innocents, including the women and the kids. So it's a very important issue for the Karzai government, but also it's a problem, I think, in the U.S. Domestically. It's a very important issue.
And Paul James, how do you evaluate the performance of this international security forces and the U.S. forces?
Well, if you want to take a look at it from the original mandate, which was the ISAF's goal, which was to create an Afghanistan that was free from the ability for Al-Qaeda to use the country as a base of operations, then yes, I think the ISAF has achieved its goal in that we are not seeing Afghanistan as a base for terrorist attacks, international terrorist attacks anymore. Of course, domestically speaking, that of course is a different story. But as was put forward, I mean, there's still a number of issues, including the political disputes that the ISAF has with the Karzai administration. You've also got, as was mentioned, the bombings, the indiscriminate bombings, some may say, of Afghan civilians, and so it's sort of a. It would be very hard to characterize as whether or not they've done their job. But what you can say to a certain degree is that what they've been able to do is create a situation now where they are training the Afghan military to take that next step potentially to help themselves. And we'll see if that plays out in the wash post 2014.
Yeah, and Lan Qianxue, actually, they are training the Afghan military, and the Afghan military is supposed to be taking over the greater responsibility in security in the country. But have these forces proven themselves to be capable and responsible enough?
Well, as far as I'm concerned, I think the Afghan security forces is still in the learning process, and it still needs the support and training from the outside world. This is my point.
And Qian Liwei, how do you see it?
I think on the national level in Afghanistan, the training is very important. Education, financial support from the international community is very important. But on the other hand, the local forces, you have to notice the local forces, because even before the Afghanistan war, there are so many, not only Taliban, the Northern Alliance, every kind of local force is quite strong in Afghanistan. So I think after the withdrawal of the international forces, there only on the national level, the solidarity is is very important. But also there's a reconciliation between all the forces, the local forces.
So let's look at the other side of the coin here. We talked a lot about security situations, but what about governance? The Hamid Karzai has been in charge of the country in theory since just after the U.S.-led invasion in the ISAF establishment. Would you say the governance situation is getting better from the Afghan government, Paul?
Well, that's a very difficult question to ask as well, because realistically, under the Taliban, you didn't have a very cohesive government. You had them in charge in Kabul, but there was very tribal alliances, which basically ran their own pockets of Afghanistan, and made it very sort of decentralized. With the inclusion and the creation of the Karzai government, you did get a better cohesive central administration, which was able to at least extend its fingers out into these more remote areas of Afghanistan and allow for a more centrally administered government. But as far as Mr. Karzai is concerned, this goes into the politics of it all. And for many the Afghan people, they view Hamid Karzai as an outsider. He was never he wasn't living in Afghanistan, didn't really have a very strong connection with Afghanistan up until the U.S.-led invasion in 2001. And many Afghans view him, even today, as basically as an American plant and somebody that may be difficult to work with as far as being cohesive when it comes to bringing and being able to unite the Afghan people together. I don't know if they view him as that figure, and I think there's still a lot of questions out there about that.
Now, Jen Shui, one of the other complaints about Karzai has, of course, been that his government is still as corrupt as any other government in Afghan's history. Karzai's own brother was widely implicated in corruption, and he was president during an enormous banking scandal. Now, a banking scandal that, in theory, the courts have now convicted people over. Is that conviction a watershed moment that is showing the government is truly committed to cracking down on corruption?
It's me?
Yes.
Well, I think in terms of the governance or the corruption, I agree with what James' point just now. The governance there is improving, and the corruption, the corruption phenomenon is a very complicated issue in Afghanistan. It has many roots, and I can't say whether a case can be a watershed or not. But I think this condition indicates that the Afghan government has realized corruption is an issue and it needs to be tackled.
Chen Liwei, would you agree? Is the Afghan government truly realized and truly committed to actually cracking down on corruption?
I don't think the problem is they truly realize, because they are incapable to do that. As I mentioned, there are so many forces in Afghanistan. Karzai is just somebody looking as the puppet of U.S. force. So I think the most important thing is that the Afghan people have to select an icon or a big figure that every forces or most of the forces recognize as the head of the state in the future. So he will be given the mandate. He will be given the mandate to do that, to govern legally. So, and in this sense, the Afghan people, with the help, with the assistance from the international community, will really fight against the corruption, the briberies, or all kinds of crimes.
And Paul James, actually, citizens in Afghanistan, they cry out for justice and demand Karzai act against foreign forces abuses. So does the Afghan population now see the ISAF or international security forces as an occupying force there?
Yes, for the most part, any foreigner in Afghanistan is viewed as an occupying force. This is a country, I mean, if you go back centuries through history, has been ruled by one force or another who is not native to the land itself, and this is ingrained in Afghan culture. So if there's a foreigner on the ground who's in charge, they are going to view him as him or her as an occupying force. That being said, I think what is we've seen change over the last couple of years at least is the Afghan people complaining less about not completely complaining less about the ISAF, but more concerned about local stability and the local corruption that's taking place on the local level, where you've got a return to a certain degree of this sort of warlordism that is taking place, not in the centralized areas, not in Kandahar, not in Kabul, but in places in the outlying areas of Afghanistan, which are still very tribal and still controlled predominantly by tribal mentalities. And I think a lot of people now in Afghanistan now have been complaining, look, we need to find a stabilizing factor and a uniting factor. The one thing, say what you will about it, the Soviet invasion in 1979 unified the country completely behind a single cause. Now that is not a factor anymore, this is where the problem sort of lies in.
Now, Lian Zhenshui, would you see that we have transitioned fully from foreign forces ever being seen as any sort of positive force to now they are just completely being seen as an occupying force?
Well, to my knowledge, I believe some population, and especially some insurgent groups in Afghanistan, still have this point in mind. some irresponsibility by the ISAF forces have deepened this mind. So this is my point.
Okay, so but do you think that the general population follows it? Insurgent forces would seemingly benefit from an argument that there's an occupying force, but do you think that the citizenry, the rank and file Afghanistan, are they really seeing the ISAF and U.S. forces as occupiers?
I don't. Up to now, I don't have any detail or statistics to indicate whether they still see it as a occupied force or not. But I think maybe a larger population in Afghanistan still have this point.
All right.
One thing that I would like to just sort of add to the discussion on this point is that when we talk about the misdeeds of the ISAF, and they do happen, and you can't get around that. These are obviously documented things that do take place. But it's like any country that has a nationalized sort of mentality around it. In that, if anybody messes with your country, as a foreign occupying force, or not even as a foreign occupying force. Anybody messes with your country, you of course are going to, focus in on it, and it's almost like a lightning rod for, complaints that run deeper than just the surface stuff, like the unfortunate bombings of people, civilians by foreign forces. It's these things that create a sense of frustration and anger, which are boiling up from many other things that are taking place on the ground in Afghanistan, and gives it sort of a focus, and that's the situation that the ISAF finds itself in right now, is that you've got Afghan people who really are looking for somebody to blame for their own woes at this point.
Well, on that note, we're going to take a pause here. Chen Li Wei, Paul James, Lan Jian Shui. The next section of the show, we're going to look at the, of course, laundry list of complaints that Afghan President Hamid Karzai has been launching at the United States and the ISAF, why he's taking them public now, and what these complaints really mean. You're listening to Today on Beyond Beijing.
Today's words shape tomorrow's discourse.
The future starts today.
Today's talk, tomorrow's world. Today.
You're listening to Today on Beyond Beijing. I'm Brandon Blackburn-Dwyer. Today's big debate is on Afghanistan, criticizing the U.S. and foreign forces in the country.
And I'm Zhao Yang. Today we are talking in the studio with Qianli Wei from the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations, and also Paul James, a journalist based in Beijing. And also joining us on the phone is Lan Jianxue from the China Institute of International Studies. But now back to our panel discussions. We just now talk about the security and governance about in Afghanistan, and now we shift our focus to the general complaints, specific complaints during the past this period of time. Actually, Afghanistan President Karzai has gone on a series of runs targeting the U.S. government and the ISAF. So, Qianli Wei, why has he become so critical now at this moment?
In my memory, this was not the first time that President Karzai criticized the international force in Afghanistan. Even before that, there's a lot of complaints, also a very sharp criticism against the internet force on human rights abuses, about June bombardment. And this time, I think, as the date of withdrawal is approaching, and I also should notice that Karzai will not be president by the end of 2014 at that time. So he will finish his presidency. But the problem is that at this moment, there are so many forces, the local forces, but also on the national level, there are so many forces. And the occupying forces here, there are some more, you can see more and more contradictions between the international forces and the local Afghanistan people. So Karzai, to solidate his position as the president, the current president, he have to do something.
So
to pacify the mood of the Afghanis people.
So, Paul James, do you think Karzai is now playing to a domestic audience to try and cement a legacy that show that he was against foreign involvement in the nation? He's not the representative of the U.S.
Well, there's certainly that element to it. If you look at the Afghan culture, there's this mentality where those in charge, those who are leading the tribe, as it were, want to be remembered and revered. Not after their leadership, but after their death, and things of this nature. So it goes part into the Afghan mentality. So there's certainly an element to that. But I think it goes beyond this too. Hamid Karzai, say what you will about some of the accusations that he's made against U.S. forces. The man is a shrewd politician, and he understands how the political realm works. And by making these accusations now against the Americans, and really sort of ramping up these accusations over the past couple of months, I think part of what he's doing is playing a bit of a shell game, in that if you're critical and you're able to be critical of the ISAF or the Americans on one hand, perhaps this may give you leverage to maybe make some stronger plays for something that maybe we're not hearing about right now, but something that perhaps he wants, whether that be more money in the future, more continued assistance. It's hard to say. I mean, you got to remember, like I said, the man is a politician first and foremost, and they're always thinking 3 or 4 steps ahead.
Okay. And Lan Jianxue, actually, Karzai says he still wants a strong relationship with the international community, but he consistently has accused them of many abuses. So can he be both in favor of a strong relationship and this publicly critical?
Well, I think the contradiction or the conflict between Karzai's government and the U.S. or the ISAF or the outside the community, or international community, I think had experienced a very long time. It's not new one. Why it become so outstanding these days? I think it is because the 2014 is coming closer, and different forces have take their own job and take their role to be in favor of in the post 2014 era.
All right, so let's look at some of these accusations that are coming out over the last couple of weeks or last 2 months or so. Now, Chen, you had said that you don't really see a big difference in these, that Karzai is always critical, but I have to say that the accusation from Karzai, specifically accusing the United States, NATO, of colluding with the Taliban. He not only referenced that both sides having violence prolonged the need for foreign forces, but he then went on to detail that he said, look, the NATO and the U.S. have contacts on a regular basis with the Taliban. This proves that they are colluding. Really? I mean, can we really see a world where the U.S. forces are colluding with the Taliban?
Sure.
Really?
Yeah.
You agree with Karzai?
Yes. Because before the U.S. troops withdraw, U.S. has changed the strategy, the tactics, because he knows he cannot defeat all the Taliban. So even before they withdraw, they have to make peace, not only with all the kind of Afghanis local forces, including the Taliban. So President Karzai thought that it will give up some power, or in the future government. In the future governance, the Karzai have to give up some kind of power. Which will make the Taliban more strong.
Okay, so
a more strong voice in the future government.
But that's not what his accusation said. His accusation said that the Taliban and U.S. forces are colluding to create violence in a scenario where U.S. forces need to continue to control the country past 2014. None of that seemed to be a complaint about.
You have to think about what's behind his mind.
So what he's really talking about is that. Now, Paul James, I mean, should NATO not be talking about peace with the Taliban? Is that proof that they're colluding, that there's even the potential for peace?
Well, I think we have to look at this from the NATO perspective in that what the ultimate goal is to leave Afghanistan at the end of 2014 in a position where you don't need to have these troops in there, and you don't need to go into this political scenario, despite what Mr. Karzai is alleging the American agenda may or may not be. The American agenda and the NATO agenda has always been to create a sense of stability in Afghanistan, where they can almost not necessarily forget about it, but certainly have that political quagmire come off their backs from their own domestic sources. I mean, you as an American, Brandon, know very well that the Afghan war has been very difficult for many a politician over the years. So to say that the Americans want to destabilize and continue the fighting so that they can maintain a presence in Afghanistan, I don't believe that's the case. No vested interest, particularly no oil. So why bother, right? But taking it a step further, and not to get into the realm of speculation too heavily, but I think part of what Mr. Karzai is doing here is not just criticizing the Americans, but he's also setting a table for himself to get a closer alliance with neighboring Pakistan. The Pakistans and the Americans have been at each other's throats, particularly because of the drones, and they've always had this sort of tentative relationship. So part of me sees this as an opportunity for him to maybe get a little bit more support within neighboring Pakistan toward his political positions, and perhaps help him out as they move forward and Afghanistan makes this transfer from ISAF into their own security forces, and will quite frankly need the Pakistanis' stronger support.
Judge Wei, what do you think of Paul's theory there? I'm struck by the fact that also one of the accusations coming out of Karzai's government is a specific focus on NATO not going after sheltering of terrorists outside of Afghanistan. And for me, that would have to be inside Pakistan. That Karzai is hammering the fact that the NATO forces are not pursuing terrorists in Pakistan. So is Afghanistan trying to be better friends with Pakistan, or are they trying to encourage more strikes inside Pakistan?
Well, first of all, I would describe the accusation as a war of words between Karzai's government or the U.S. government. To my mind, it indicates the difference concerning the talking to the Taliban or talking to the insurgent groups, because the U.S. is taking their part in talking with the Taliban, and the Afghanistan government is still do their own job. So I think the different talkings have different scenario, different schedule. Maybe it will create some differences step. So this is why I believe they have quarrel or they have accusation at each other.
All right. Well, Paul James, it was your assertion that Afghanistan is trying to create a better opening for Pakistan, but also I'll flip the question back to you. If that's really their goal, why would Karzai and his presidential spokesperson recently just go on a continual rant for about a week, saying that NATO forces are targeting terrorists in the wrong places and that they're failing to go after them in sanctuaries outside of Afghanistan?
Well, I mean, there's certainly an element to it, and again, I'm just putting out a theory. I'm just floating things. I'm
not trying to attack you. I'm just trying to say, how does it line up?
No, and fair enough. And I mean, to be honest with you, I think there is some legitimacy to the point that Karzai is trying to make. You got to remember that Pakistan and Afghanistan. I mean, we look at it on a map, and you can put that defined border on there. But realistically, you're talking about a massive mountain range. Where there is no real sense and definable border. And what Mr. Karzai is talking about is that the ISAF is hitting targets on the Afghan side of the border, but they're not hitting the mountain range next door in Pakistan because of this geopolitical line that is put down there. And from that point of view, I could see why he's a little bit angry. That said, I still sort of like my broader theory of them at least trying to move a little bit more closely allied with Islamabad because of the fact that once the ISAF goes in the end of 2014, Afghanistan is on its own and is going to need its neighbors for help.
Chen Liwei, one last summation of this in the overview. Is the goal here, Karzai complaining about NATO and the U.S. to open up the possibility of a better relationship with Pakistan?
I think
feel free to dispute my theories.
But in the future, I think it's quite important that Afghan have a very good relationship with Pakistan, not only because the terrorists part of some terrorists are hiding in the mountains near the AfPak border, but also, for the reconstruction of the future Afghanistan, Pakistan will play a very important role in the future.
All right, well, we're going to take a pause here. Chen Liwei, Paul James, Lan Jian Shui. Next section of the show, we're going to look at some of the more detailed complaints here, particularly an issue over airstrikes and special forces in Wardak province. You're listening to Today on Beyond Beijing.
Missed some of today's big debate? No need to panic. Follow us on iTunes. Just search for Today on Beyond Beijing and subscribe to have our podcast delivered to you every day.
Today's words shape tomorrow's discourse.
The future starts today.
Today's talk, tomorrow's world. Today.
You're listening to Today on Beyond Beijing. I'm Brandon Blackburn-Dwyer. Today's big debate is on Afghanistan, criticizing the U.S. and foreign forces in his country.
And I'm Zhao Yang. Today we are talking in the studio with Tian Liwei from the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations, and also Paul James, a journalist based in Beijing. And also joining us on the phone is Lan Jianxue from the China Institute of International Studies. But now back to our panel discussions. We just now talk about some general complaints, including the collusions and the NATO focus and so on. But now we shift our focus to some specific issues. Paul James, actually, Karzai has banned Afghan military from calling in foreign airstrikes after civilians were killed in an attack like this in early February. The Afghan army called in the airstrike. So does that mean they are at least partly to blame?
Well, that one particular incident created this sort of fire swell of complaints that there wasn't enough. I guess better coordination was needed between the two forces, and I think really sort of generated complaints, possibly from Mr. Karzai, that the Afghan forces were being played off as almost second fiddle to a certain degree. But it does raise the larger question of what his the intentions are as far as stability in and around the Kabul region is concerned. Wardak, of course, is just directly west of the capital, Kabul, and it's been sort of a hotbed of insurgency for the past few years or so, and really sort of raises the larger question. I think, if does the Afghan government really want to see the Afghan forces take control there and move into a position where they can dictate the terms of how things will play out in an area that is strategically rather secure as far as the geography of Afghanistan is. So it seems a little arbitrary at first, but I think maybe if you look take a step or two forward, perhaps this is where Mr. Karzai's position is coming from on this end.
And so, Lan Jianxue, can the Afghan military operate now without foreign air power and airstrikes capability?
Well, I think the Afghan army is still in building their own themselves. It's not strong enough to complete all missions. It still needs the outside world support, especially from U.S. and NATO, because U.S. NATO has been operating actions in Afghanistan for so many years. And yes.
And Tian Liwei, do you agree with Jianxue?
I really doubt that if they really want to defeat the Taliban, it's not about the capability, about their real intention to defeat the Taliban.
All right. So let's look at another issue here. Afghan President Hamid Karzai publicly banned U.S. Special Forces and their Afghan counterparts working in Wardak province. Now, Wardak province is less than 40-minute drive from the capital of Kabul, and by U.S. Special Forces considered to be an incredibly important area that still has significant Taliban activity. Paul James, at the basis of this ban is an accusation that U.S. forces are committing torture and crimes against the local community, and even in local Afghan media, they're referencing also the Afghan counterpart. So, first of all, do you find these issues credible? And if you do, where's the criticism of the Afghan counterparts?
Right. To be honest with you, these reports I do not find particularly credible. You're getting these second and third hand sourced, and they're being sourced to media outlets which are definitely not, shall we say, delved in with a pro-American point of view. So I think the veracity of some of these claims that are being made are a little bit far-fetched. But again, there has to be a sense of accountability, not just with the ISAF, but as you pointed out, Brandon, with their Afghan counterparts and their Afghan colleagues, I guess if you want to say that, as well. These guys have gone through the process of being trained. They're being paid by the Afghan government now, and they need to take take that next step to the point where these sorts of issues, not just from the ISAF side, but from their side as well, do not begin to crop up even more and sort of take on a life of their own, where you revert to where we had Afghanistan post 2001, where, like I alluded to before, where you had just local tribal leaders and local forces dictating what went on in particular regions. And I think that's a major concern and something that I think needs to be addressed from the Afghan military side, and something that I think the ISAF really needs to impress upon the leadership of the Afghan military.
Now, John Shui, when you're looking at this situation, there is a corresponding ban from Karzai saying that all irregular forces that cooperate with international military forces need to either be disbanded or join the Afghan military. And these types of groups, these middle ground gray area groups that are being implicated in the actions in Wardak. Now, why is Karzai skipping over these gray area Afghan populated forces and going right at accusations of U.S. Special Forces?
I think in terms of the U.S. forces or Special Forces, it is very controversial issue in Afghanistan, not just in Afghanistan, in the whole South Asia, like in Afghanistan or in Pakistan also the case, because it concerning the sovereignty and the life of people there. So I think it's very controversial. It's very easy to escalate the tension there. In terms of the accusation, I think that's to my own knowledge, that is only because the withdrawing deadline is coming closer and closer, and different parties have their own different consideration in the post-2014 scenario.
Now, one of the issues here, there is a deal today on the Wardak issue, and it was 10 days after the proposed deadline by Karzai to have Special Forces leave the area. Now, this deal includes a limitation of Special Forces in one particular area of Karnak, an area called Nurk, which Special Forces say is a hotbed for Taliban, but Special Forces will still operate there. Now, why would we see a deal on this? I mean, and why would we see a deal that effectively seems to keep the U.S. Special Forces doing exactly what they were doing in the first place? Chen?
I think it's quite difficult for President Karzai to ask the NATO force to stop all the attacks. And so if in the regions where Taliban forces are very active, and the Afghanistan government forces, the security forces is so weak, he still want the help, the assistance from the ISF, and in other regions, it's quite difficult.
Okay. Now, one of the issues that had come up as this was being negotiated, Chuck Hagel, Secretary of Defense for the United States, had hinted earlier in the week that a deal could be reached on Wardak, and he'd hinted that a deal would have to be in exchange for the U.S. government handing over all remaining prisons at Bagram. Now, We aren't seeing an explicit deal mentioning Bagram, but Paul, do you think that with that hint earlier in the week that now that we have a deal in Wardak, we'll see a deal on the Bagram prisons?
Well, as I sort of suggested before, I mean, this is where the boots on the ground and things that are taking place on the ground really get into the nuts and bolts of the political machinations that are taking place between the ISAF, the Americans, and the Karzai administration. Now, the Bagram prison is a big issue because there's some 3,000 Taliban that are still being held there, and really this is something that has frustrated Hamid Karzai's administration because there's a lot of resentment towards an American-run prison still operating within the borders of Afghanistan, and I can understand where they're coming from, but the problem is that from a special operations point of view, and this is just looking at it from the American perspective, they have to go and do things under the course of cover. They can't go out and announce what they're going to be doing. This is the frustration that lies not just with the Karzai administration, but also in Islamabad as well, that special forces are taking steps to try and root out who they figure are the bad guys, and they're not telling the administrations about this. And this is a frustration for them politically because they all, when you're in a position of political power, you want to know what is happening within your borders. And that creates this sense of uncertainty, and this is what creates, I think, the overall sense of frustration, getting back to the broader issue of, Mr. Karzai and what he wants to see as far as the American forces and special operations forces are concerned. Getting to your specific question, will we see a deal? I kind of think we will. I really do. You've got Chuck Hagel in there now, probably wants to put his own particular stamp on the end of the situation in Afghanistan. So, yeah, I believe we will see something come out. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but in a couple of weeks' time, or maybe even sooner.
So, Qianli Wei, talking about the Bagram prison, why is NATO still holding some prisoners there? Shouldn't they have moved out by now?
Because it is quite important for NATO forces. It is reported that the prisoners behind bars are some militants, but also some suspects of terrorists. So it's in Chinese we say if we release, it's so difficult to get them back. Very, very, very difficult. And the NATO forces are so busy to fight against Taliban, the terrorists, and didn't think too much about how to deal with all these militants. There should be a kind of a process of trial, or a lot of the Afghanistan government do that, or will the NATO forces do that? It will take a long time.
So, Jianxue, actually, is Karzai really going to release those prisoners?
Well, like James said before, there are like 3,000 Taliban was kept in that prison, and this is whether they release those people or not is not a very important issue. The important issue is that who can be in charge of the whole talking process to the Taliban or the other insurgent groups. This is the point. That's why they are fighting against each other on this issue, on this small issue in terms to my mind.
Now, John Shui, in your view, would a deal on Bagram Prison in the near future, as Paul James had suggested, prove that Karzai's interest in Wardak wasn't really about the special forces, but was about pressuring a final deal on Bagram?
I didn't see the deal. What was the detail of the deals? But I think both sides are talking to each other in their own way. Maybe it appears that they are fighting against each other. There are some war of words, but I think secretly they still have their own operation, have their own talking to each other, to exchange with each other on this issue. Okay,
briefly, Paul James, do you think that if there is this deal on Bagram, that it really shows that Karzai didn't care about Wardak, and that it was just a pressure point?
It could be. I mean, again, politics being politics, you horse trade all the time, and some could view that as a bit of maybe a self-serving move on his part. Though, I mean, there is a point that, and some might say that the issues of the special forces in Wardak are a concern for the Afghan administration because of the point I was making before, is that it's strategically located next to Kabul. And it really is, an area where the Afghan government really wants to, exert its own authority. So, I mean, there's definitely argument on both ways.
All right, Chen Li Wei, Paul James, Lian Jian Shui. Last section of the show, we're going to look at the overarching debate on how long and how many troops will stay from foreign forces in Afghanistan. You're listening to Today on Beyond Beijing.
Listen to us on the go by subscribing to Today on Beyond Beijing's podcast on iTunes, or listen online at radio.weibo.com and search for AM 846.
Today's words shape tomorrow's discourse.
The future starts today.
Today's talk, tomorrow's world. Today.
You're listening to Today on Beyond Beijing. I'm Brandon Blackburn's Wire. Today's big debate is on Afghanistan, criticizing the U.S. and foreign forces in the country.
And I'm Zhao Yang. Today we are talking in the studio with Li Wei from the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations, and Paul James, a journalist based in Beijing. And also joining us on the phone is Lan Jianxue from the China Institute of International Studies.
Now, in the previous parts of our show, we've talked a lot about the current situation, progress, security, and governance. We've also talked about a litany of complaints by Afghan President Hamid Karzai against the United States, everything from airstrikes to special forces to the United States and NATO still controlling prisoners in a prison. But now let's talk about what's going to happen next. There has recently been a deal by NATO to extend funding for the Afghan military. This isn't NATO troops, this is funding for the Afghan military through 2018. Qian, considering how angry and how publicly critical Hamid Karzai is of NATO, is this really going to encourage NATO to continue to fund the Afghan military for the next 6 years?
I think President Karzai will not refuse any financial assistance.
Right, but what about NATO? I mean, he wouldn't refuse it. What about NATO? I mean, is NATO really going to sit there and be told that they're evil, that they're unjust, that their actions are targeting its civilians? Are they really going to take that criticism and go, sure, we're fine with giving you millions of dollars?
Whether they will take this criticism is one question, and the arrangement for the security in the future of Afghanistan is another thing, I think. Because it's in the interest not only in the future Afghanistan government and Afghanistan people, but also in the interest of the NATO forces, also the international community, or the regional security.
So, Paul James, we're also talking about the United States keeping troops in Afghanistan past 2014. Some estimate 6,000, 9,000, 13,000, 15,000. I mean, big numbers here. This is not a small amount of people. Will the international community, the U.S., NATO, be committed financially and with personnel on the ground with such harsh criticism coming out?
Well, actually, I believe that they will, and I'll tell you why. The United States, in particular, learned a very good lesson about the idea of cutting and running. They learned that after they gave their tacit and very large amount of assistance to the Mujahideen during their fights with the Soviets, and then when all was said and done, and the Soviets withdrew in 1989, the funding dried up, and this allowed the Taliban to take over. Vis-a-vis, you got Al-Qaeda, which was able to move in because there was no stability in government, and then vis-a-vis, you had 9/11, and the cycle repeated itself. And I think you've got administrations now who have a longer-term view in the United States and elsewhere around the world that you can't just go in and set up a new government somewhere and then leave it to its devices. You have to be able to play the long game. And despite what Mr. Karzai says, and I mean, if I was Anders Fogh Rasmussen Afghanistan and I had to sit here and listen to him badmouth my organization day in and day out, I probably wouldn't be very happy either. But that being said, I think the countries that support NATO realize over the long term that it's something that they have to do.
Briefly, why different in Afghanistan than in Iraq? We did cut and run out of Iraq. We've left the country. There are no foreign forces left. Why stay in Afghanistan and not in Iraq?
Well, look at the current situation on the ground in Iraq, where you've had the 10th anniversary of the start of the Iraq War, see suicide bombings taking place all over the countryside. You've got an administration in there now that is struggling with sectarian violence, not just between the Shias and the Sunnis, but you've got a Kurdish alliance up in the north that is very adamant about being independent of itself as well. And you know what? I mean, the situation in Iraq, not really that good right now. So perhaps you take a look at that and you go, maybe they do need help over the longer term.
Okay, so Qian Liwei, so how should the international community react, and how should Karzai react now? How can the long game be played?
At present, I think it's a lot of contradictions between the local forces, and the national level forces, but also between the Afghanis people, the Afghanis government, with the foreign forces, the international forces. So I think that both parties, all the parties, really have to have a very concrete, very frank talks to ensure, to confirm that which are the interests, the common interests of all the parties.
Okay, and Paul James, you raise up a very good question. But now answer it, how the long game should be played.
Well, it's played out through a continued funding and financing. One of the bigger terms is beyond the military operations in Afghanistan, past 2014, it's a country that needs money. It's basically on the verge of insolvency. The main cash crop, unfortunately, is heroin. And you've got a society that is really undereducated. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, a society that is basically known 2 to 3 generations of nothing but war. So you've got to have a huge amount of money put forward towards not just rebuilding the society, but re-educating a society and getting a society developed that can really push itself forward and eventually take the reins for itself.
Well, with that, we're going to go to a bit of a wrap-up here, a couple of yes and no questions to finish this out. First one here, it was the first question of the show. Yes or no, is the security situation in Afghanistan improving? Yes or no? Paul James?
Yes, with a caveat in that it's not as good as it could be, but it's better than it was during the Taliban.
Okay, so just yes or no is here, Chen?
No good signs.
No good signs. Lan?
No.
Okay. Now, is the governance in Afghanistan improving? Yes or no, Paul?
Yes.
Chen?
A little bit.
Lan?
Yes.
Now, are U.S. and international forces colluding with the Taliban? Yes or no, Paul?
No.
Chen?
Yes.
Yes, interesting. Lan?
Well, I think it's no.
Think it's no, okay. Now, should U.S. Special Forces be banned from Wardak province? Yes or no, Paul James?
No.
Chen?
No.
Lan?
No.
Should the U.S. hand over all prisoners at Bagram Prison? Yes or no, Paul James?
Yes.
Chen?
No.
Lan?
No.
All right. Now, should the U.S. keep troops in Afghanistan after 2014? Paul James?
Yes.
Yes.
Chen?
Yes.
Okay. And Len?
Yes.
Now, should NATO continue to fund the Afghan army through 2018? Yes or no, Paul James?
Yes.
Chen?
Sure.
Len?
Yes.
And are we optimistic or pessimistic about the relationship between Afghanistan and foreign forces? Optimistic or pessimistic, Paul?
Pessimistic.
Chen?
Pessimistic.
Lan?
Pessimistic.
Wow, on that resoundingly negative note here that ends my great debate here. My thanks to our guests. We've been speaking in the studio with Qian Liwei, Research Fellow at the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. We also had Paul James, a journalist based here in Beijing. On the phone with Lan Jianshui, Research Fellow on Afghanistan at the China Institute of International Studies and former Chinese diplomat. Tomorrow, we're going to be debating the crisis hitting the U.S. city of Detroit. But stay with us now for the Global Talk.